Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Amber and today I want to share a deeply emotional story with you. It's a tale of love, betrayal, and the unbreakable bonds of family. Please make sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any of these heartfelt stories. Now, let's begin. I was born into a family where love was conditional, and affection was a currency traded for obedience. My earliest memories are not of lullabies or bedtime stories, but of hushed arguments behind closed doors and the cold silence that followed. My mother, a woman of grace and resilience, tried to shield me from the storm that was my father. He was a man of stature in society, but within the walls of our home, he was a tyrant. As a child, I often wondered why my mother stayed. Was it love, fear, or the hope that one day things would change? She would smile through the pain, her eyes betraying the turmoil within. I remember the nights she would tuck me into bed, whispering promises of a better tomorrow. Even as fresh bruises adorned her skin. School became my sanctuary. It was the only place where I felt seen and heard. My teachers praised my diligence, unaware that I buried myself in books to escape the reality at home. I found solace in stories and characters who faced adversity and emerged victorious. They became my silent mentors, teaching me that strength wasn't about physical might but the courage to stand up for oneself. As I grew older, the cracks in our family facade became more evident. My father's temper worsened and my mother's spirit dimmed. I tried to intervene to protect her, but I was just a teenager against a man consumed by his demons. One evening, after a particularly violent outburst, I found my mother sitting alone, tears streaming down her face. She looked at me and said, "Promise me you'll never let anyone dim your light." That night, I made a vow to myself. I would break the cycle. College was my escape route. I earned a scholarship and moved to a different city, determined to build a life free from the shadows of my past. I studied psychology, driven by a desire to understand the complexities of human behavior, to make sense of the chaos I had endured. I met people who showed me kindness, who believed in me, and slowly, I began to heal. Years passed, and I became a counselor, helping others navigate their traumas. But the past has a way of catching up. One day, I received a call from a neighbor. Back home, my mother had passed away. The news shattered me. I returned for the funeral, stepping into the house that held so many painful memories. My father, now a frail man, showed no remorse. He spoke of my mother as if she were a burden he had borne. Anger surged within me. How could he speak of her that way? She had sacrificed everything for him, endured years of abuse, and he dismissed her as if she were nothing. I realized that confronting him wouldn't bring her back, but I couldn't let her story end this way. I decided to write a memoir, detailing my mother's life, her strength, and the pain she endured. It became a bestseller, resonating with countless others who had faced similar struggles. Through her story, I aim to shed light on domestic abuse and the silent battles many fight daily. My father tried to sue me for defamation, but the truth was on my side. The court dismissed his claims, and he faded into obscurity. I used the proceeds from the book to establish a foundation in my mother's name, providing support to victims of domestic violence. Through this journey, I found purpose. My mother's legacy lived on, not as a victim, but as a beacon of hope for others. And in telling her story, I found my own voice. After my mother's funeral, I stayed in my childhood home for a few days longer than planned. I wasn't ready to leave, yet not because I missed the place, but because something inside me refused to walk away without doing justice to the pain that still lingered in every room, every piece of furniture, every worn-out photo frame. One night, I was sitting in my mother's old room, which had been kept mostly untouched. The air smelled faintly of her perfume, the one she wore every day, light, floral, comforting. As I sat there, a drawer in her old dresser caught my eye. It had always been locked, and I never dared ask what she kept inside. But now the key was taped beneath the drawer, as if she had always intended for me to find it when the time came. My hands trembled as I unlocked it and opened it slowly. Inside were dozens of letters she had written but never sent. Some were to me, some to her own mother, and some, heartbreakingly, to my father. She had written about the beatings, the isolation, her fear, her longing for love, her thoughts of leaving, and her deep regret for staying. But the one she wrote to me broke me the most. She called me her strength, her only light in a life of darkness. She apologized for every tear I had shed, every moment I had to grow up too fast. I cried like I hadn't cried in years. And at that moment, I made another vow. I wasn't done yet. Her story wasn't fully told. The foundation I created in. Her name, it had to grow. It had to reach those who were still trapped like she had been. I went back to the city and poured my soul into expanding the organization. I hired counselors, legal experts, volunteers, and women who had lived through horrors but survived. We called it She's Safe Haven for Empowerment. Within a year, she became a beacon in the community. Women started reaching out, sharing their stories. Some came in person, some wrote letters, some called in the middle of the night. They came with black eyes and broken spirits. But we gave them shelter, safety, and something even more powerful, hope. Meanwhile, my father's health began to decline rapidly. He had no one to care for him. His relatives had long turned their backs. His friends, the ones who cheered him in his power days, had disappeared. Karma had begun its slow, painful work. One afternoon, I received a call. He was in a government hospital in a state of disrepair, barely able to talk. My first instinct was to ignore it. But something pushed me to go see him, not out of love, but to show him what I had become without him. I walked into that hospital room in silence. His eyes widened when he saw me. The once mighty man now looked like a forgotten shadow. He tried to speak, but coughed instead. I sat down beside him, my face expressionless. He reached for my hand, and for a second I let him hold it. Then he said something I never expected. I read the book... I know what I did. I deserve this. There was no apology, no grand confession. Just that, a broken man acknowledging the truth too late. I looked at him, the man who had haunted my dreams, shaped my fears, and unknowingly taught me how strong I could be. I stood up and whispered, "You don't deserve my forgiveness, but I forgive you for me, not for you." I left without turning back. A week later, he died. I didn't attend the funeral. I didn't cry. That chapter had closed, but my mother's chapter? It was still being written every time she helped a woman rebuild her life. Every time a little girl was saved from growing up in fear. Every time a voice broke the silence that abuse tried to bury. I was invited to speak at conferences, schools, and shelters. People called me brave, a survivor. But deep down, I was still that little girl who held her mother's hand under the table while her father screamed. I just chose to turn that pain into power. And then one day, something happened that changed everything. A girl named Emily walked into the shelter. She was only 16, with bruises and tears and stories that mirrored my own. Her stepfather had abused her for years, and her mother had turned a blind eye. When I sat with her, she didn't speak, just stared at the wall. I knew that look. I had worn it. For days she wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep. I stayed with her, reading my mother's letters out loud every night. Slowly, she began to speak. One word, then a sentence. Then her whole story. She told me she had tried to end her life twice. That she thought no one would ever believe her. That she thought the pain would never end. I held her and said, "I believe you, and it ends now." Emily became our youngest volunteer within a year. She started speaking at schools, sharing her story. She called me her hero, but in truth, she saved me too. Through her, I saw my mother's wish come true to never let anyone dim my light and to help others shine too. As I stood one day at the shelter's new wing named Mira's Place after my mom, I closed my eyes and whispered, "We did it, Mama." The wind blew gently, and I swear I felt her presence in that moment. Her story had become a movement. A legacy, and my story? It was still unfolding. After the opening of Mira's Place, our foundation grew faster than I had ever imagined. We were being noticed not just by the community, but by national media. People from across the country reached out with donations, offers to volunteer, and most importantly, with their own stories. Some were survivors, others were still trapped, waiting for a lifeline. I hired a small team to manage all the outreach while I focused on our shelter programs. But deep inside me, something still felt unsettled. I had built something beautiful. From pain, but I hadn't really stopped to breathe. I hadn't allowed myself to live, to feel joy without guilt. One night, while sorting through more of my mother's letters I hadn't had the strength to read before, I found a small note wrapped in old paper. It wasn't a letter. It was a photo. Me and her sitting in the backyard, sun on our faces, her arm around me, her smile radiant. On the back, she'd written, "No matter what happens, promise me you'll find your own happiness, not out of revenge, but because you deserve it." That line hit me harder than anything before. I realized I had become a warrior, a protector, an advocate, but I had forgotten how to be just me. I had become the voice for so many women, yet my own voice, the one that laughed, that loved, that dreamed, had grown quiet. I looked around my apartment that night. It was filled with books, awards, framed pictures of our success stories. But it felt empty. I hadn't been on a date in years. I hadn't even let anyone close to me, afraid they might one day hurt me like he did. My father's shadow still loomed over my heart. That night, for the first time, I wrote a letter to myself. "Dear me, I forgive you for being afraid. I forgive you for building walls instead of bridges. But it's time now to live for you." The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I took the day off, no phones, no meetings. I went to a nearby lake, a peaceful place my mother had once taken me as a child. I sat under a tree, closed my eyes, and let the silence speak. I cried, not out of pain, but out of release. I felt her with me, not as a ghost, but as a presence. As if she was saying, "You're doing great, but don't forget to smile." And so I started healing differently. I started saying yes to dinners with friends, to road trips, to new clothes that weren't just black and gray. I started journaling not just my pain, but my dreams. I started painting, something I had loved as a child but gave up when life got too hard. One day, during a charity event, I met someone. His name was Daniel. He wasn't flashy or overly charming. He was quiet, kind, and asked about my mother, not out of politeness, but genuine curiosity. I was guarded at first. I didn't trust easily, but he didn't push. He just kept showing up in little ways. He'd send coffee to the shelter. He'd volunteer for events. He painted a mural for Mira's Place, an image of a woman standing in a field of sunflowers, strong, free, and smiling. I stared at that mural for hours. It looked like my mother. I asked him why he chose that image. He simply said, "Because." That's what healing looks like to me. Slowly, I let him in. I told him my story, not just the headlines, but the messy, raw parts. He didn't flinch. He listened. He held space for my pain. For the first time in years, I felt safe with someone. Truly safe. One evening, as we sat watching the sun dip below the horizon, he asked me a question that stopped me cold. "What do you want, just for you?" I froze. No one had ever asked me that, not without an agenda, not with sincerity. I thought about it, really thought. I said, "I want to feel light again. I want to walk into a room and not scan it for danger. I want to laugh without checking. If it's too loud, I want to live." He didn't say anything. He just reached out and held my hand. And in that moment, I knew I was getting there, not because of him, but because I had decided it was time. Around that time, a woman named Clara arrived at the shelter. She was in her 50s with a quiet strength in her eyes. She told us she had endured 30 years of abuse before finally running away. She had no money, no family left, and no confidence, but she had courage. Clara began helping in the kitchen. She'd cook for the girls, sit with them, tell them stories of resilience. She became a mother figure to so many. One day I sat with her and asked, "Why didn't you leave sooner?" Her answer has never left me. She said, "Because I didn't know I was allowed to choose myself." That was it. That was the truth so many lived with. I went home that night and rewrote the mission statement for She. It would now begin with, "You are allowed to choose yourself. Today, tomorrow, always." I knew we were doing something bigger than sheltering victims. We were restoring identities. We were reminding women that they are not broken. They are rebuilding. That's not weakness. That's power. With this renewed spirit, we launched new programs, vocational training, therapy retreats, scholarships for survivors. We created a podcast called Her Voice, where women could anonymously share their journeys. The response was overwhelming. Stories poured in. One woman from Texas wrote, "I played your podcast for my daughter and she finally said, 'Mom, let's leave.' We left that night. That message made me cry for hours. Because I knew my mother would be proud. I knew her pain had become someone else's salvation. And through that, I found peace. One night, I stood alone outside Mira's Place. The sky was clear, the stars bright. I whispered into the night, "We're okay now, Mama. You and me, we're okay." The wind rustled gently as if she was saying, "Yes, my love. You are. More than okay. You're free." Months passed like pages in a well-read book, each chapter filled with growth, healing, and stories of transformation from within Myra's place and beyond. But life, as it often does, doesn't remain still not, even in moments of peace. One morning, while sipping tea and reviewing grant applications in my office, my phone buzzed with a name I hadn't seen in years: Aunt Layla, my mother's younger sister. We had lost contact long ago after she moved to Chicago following a family argument I barely remembered. My hands trembled as I answered. Her voice on the other end was soft, hesitant, and cracking with emotion. I've been following your journey," she said. "I watched your interview on national television about the shelter. I saw your mother's face in you." Tears welled up in my eyes. I remembered her warm hugs and bedtime stories when she would sneak in during holidays. She'd been the only one who ever tried to stand up to my father, but she left when he made it clear she wasn't welcome. She never came back, and my mother never blamed her. "I should have done more," she whispered. "I should have taken her away." I swallowed my tears and told her, "You didn't fail. We were all trapped in different ways." She wanted to visit, and I welcomed her with an open heart. When she arrived, older and quieter than I remembered, we hugged for a long time without saying a word. It was as if my mother had returned in another form. She walked through Mira's place and wept silently, placing her hand gently on the mural of my mother surrounded by sunflowers. Later that evening, we sat on the rooftop of my apartment, wrapped in blankets, watching the city lights flicker. She told me stories of my mother I had never heard before: her dreams of becoming a teacher, how she loved to sing at weddings, how she once wrote poetry but stopped when she married. I had never known that side of her. All I had were pieces of the woman she was before pain stole her voice. That night, I found myself writing again. This time, not letters to the past or reflections of pain, but stories. Stories of who she was, who she could have been, and who she became despite the sorrow. Aunt Layla encouraged me to turn those stories into a children's book, something to teach young girls about strength, dreams, and healing. I called it Mira's Garden, and every character was inspired by the women we'd helped, including little Emily and strong Clara. The book was illustrated by Daniel, his art capturing every emotion I poured into the pages. It became more than a book. It became a movement. Schools started using it for emotional literacy. Libraries featured it in healing corners. Mothers read it to daughters with tears in their eyes. But just as I was embracing this new joy, something happened that shook me to my core. One of our newest residents, a quiet young woman named Aisha, went missing one morning. Her bed was made, her bag was gone, but she had left no note. Panic gripped the entire shelter. We called the hospitals, the police, her emergency contacts. Nothing. I blamed myself. She had come to us after surviving a near-fatal attack from her husband, and she had shown signs of progress, smiling occasionally, attending group sessions, even starting a journaling habit. But maybe I missed something. Maybe I wasn't paying close enough attention. Days passed. Then a week. The weight of her absence haunted me. Every night I dreamed she was calling my name, reaching for me through shadows. And then one morning we received a letter. From her, it was addressed to me. The envelope smelled of rosewater. The letter read, "Dear Myra's Place, and dear you my lighthouse, my second mother, I didn't run away. I ran toward something, toward freedom. I boarded a bus to another city where a friend offered me a fresh start. I wanted to tell you in person, but I was afraid I'd never have the strength to go if I saw your face. I just want you to know. You saved me, all of you. I wake up now without fear. I walk without looking over my shoulder. I sing in the morning. I smile at my reflection. Please don't be sad. Be proud, because you taught me to choose myself." And I finally did. I cried for hours after reading that letter. Not out of grief, but out of the deepest joy I had ever felt. Because even if she wasn't with us anymore, she was free. That was the goal. That had always been the goal. To help them find their own wings. Aisha's letter reminded me that healing doesn't always happen where we are. It happens where we choose to be. Inspired, we launched a new program called Flight, a scholarship fund for survivors to relocate, rebuild, and reimagine their lives wherever they chose. It was our most successful campaign yet. That same month, I was invited to speak at a United Nations summit on women's rights. Me, a girl who once hid under the kitchen table. A woman who once thought her story didn't matter. Now I stood before a global audience telling my mother's story, my own story, and the stories of countless women like us. And when I finished speaking, the room was silent. Not because they didn't care, but because they were moved. A woman from a small African country walked up to me and said, "Your pain became our light." That one sentence felt like a crown on my mother's name. When I returned home, Daniel was waiting with dinner, candles, and something else, a tiny box. My heart stopped. He knelt down, smiling nervously, and said, "I don't want to save you. I know you've already saved yourself, but I want to walk beside you, through light, through darkness. Will you let me?" I cried, not because I needed him, but because I realized I wanted him. And that too was powerful. I said yes, not just to him, but to love, to joy, to everything I had once believed I'd never deserve. The wedding was simple, intimate. Aunt Layla walked me down the aisle, and the ceremony was held in the garden behind Mira's place. Every woman we had helped was there. They wore white and carried sunflowers. My mother's mural stood tall behind us. And in that moment, I felt whole. Completely, beautifully whole. Because this wasn't the ending. It was the beginning of something new. After the wedding, something inside me softening. For years I had walked like a soldier head held high, back straight, guarding my emotions, shielding my past, determined to be strong for everyone else. But now I began to live differently. Not from a place of survival, but from peace. I woke up without dread. I laughed without guilt. I held Daniel's hand with no fear that it would one day let go. Myra's place continued to grow. We received international funding, and survivors from other countries began writing to us. One message came from a woman in Lebanon. She wrote, "I saw your story. I'm still in my abusive marriage, but your strength makes me believe I can survive." Another message from a teenager in Ohio read, "My stepfather is just like yours. I thought I was alone until I heard your voice." These messages began pouring in not hundreds, but thousands. I couldn't reply to them all, but I read every word. And with each story, I realized we weren't just healing the women our town, we were starting a ripple across the world. But even as life blossomed around me, a part of me felt a quiet longing I hadn't spoken aloud. I wanted to become a mother. The idea scared me at first. What if I wasn't ready? What if I passed down my trauma? What if I failed? But Daniel, ever the patient soul, gently reminded me that the very fact I was asking those questions meant I wouldn't fail. We tried for over a year, and every negative test felt like a silent defeat. I didn't cry. I stayed strong, telling myself, "You've survived worse." But one night, alone in the shower, I broke. I fell to my knees, sobbing from a place deeper than I knew existed. I wanted to be a mother not to fix the past, but to build a future. One where love wasn't conditional, where bedtime stories were sacred, not distractions from yelling, where a child could grow up knowing their worth. We explored adoption. And just as we began the process, we received a call from a social worker who had heard about Myra's place. "There's a baby girl," she said, "born prematurely. Her mother was a survivor who passed away during childbirth. The baby has no family. She needs a home." I stood frozen, tears immediately blurring my vision. Daniel squeezed my hand. "Let's meet her." At the hospital, I held her for the first time, tiny, fragile, wrapped in a blanket too big for her. She opened her eyes, and in them I saw everything: pain, strength, innocence, and an unspoken plea for love. We named her Hope, because that's what she brought into our lives. I brought her home wrapped in the same pink blanket my mother had once made for me. Every night, as I rocked her to sleep, I whispered stories, not of pain, but of strength. "You come from a long line of warriors," I told her. "But your story will be different," and it was. As Hope grew, so did our family. She had not only our love, but the love of dozens of women at Myra's place. Clara became her godmother. Emily, now studying social work, became her babysitter. Aunt Layla spoiled her endlessly with homemade clothes. And me, I finally found what peace truly meant. Years passed. Hope turned 4, then 5, full of questions, curiosity, and light. She once asked me, "Mama, who's that lady in the painting?" pointing to the mural of my mother. I smiled. That's your grandmother. She was brave, just like you. Do you miss her? She asked. Every day, I whispered. But she lives in us now. One evening, as we sat by the fireplace, Hope nestled in my lap, Daniel playing guitar softly nearby, she looked up at me and said, "Mama, are we safe forever?" Her question made my heart swell. I kissed her forehead and said, "Yes, my love, we are safe, forever." But life, unpredictable as ever, had more to write in my story. One morning as I prepared breakfast, I received an email. It was from a journalist. "We are producing a documentary on survivors who became leaders," it read. "We would like to feature you and Mira's place." I hesitated. I had shared my story through writing, through talks, but cameras felt invasive. But Daniel said something that stayed with me. "Your voice has already changed lives. Imagine what your face, your presence, your truth could do." And so I agreed. The film crew arrived weeks later. They followed me through the shelter, interviewed residents, captured our daily work. But the hardest part came when they asked to film in my childhood home, the same house. I hadn't returned there since my father's death. It had been sold, abandoned, forgotten, but something pulled me to say yes. We walked through the empty halls, dust dancing in the sunlight, silence echoing from cracked walls. The kitchen where I once hid. The staircase where I had tripped and he hadn't cared. The window my mother used to stare out of. I stood in my old bedroom, now just bare floors and peeling paint. And for a moment I saw myself small, scared, broken. Then I looked beside me and saw Hope, holding my hand, strong, curious, unafraid. And I realized I had rewritten this story. This house no longer held power over me. It was just bricks. The pain had passed. The legacy had changed. The documentary aired months later. It was titled Echoes from Hurt to Hope. It won awards, was screened in schools, and inspired other survivors to build shelters across the country. I received letters from men, 2 sons who watched their mothers suffer, and now wanted to break the cycle. The ripple had become a wave. But the proudest moment came on Mother's Day when Hope stood in front of her school and read a short speech she wrote herself. "My mama helps people who are sad. She makes them feel happy again. She tells them stories and hugs them a lot. She's brave like a superhero, but she doesn't wear a cape. She wears love." I cried right there in the middle of the school hall, surrounded by clapping strangers and smiling teachers. Because in her tiny voice, I heard my mother. I heard myself. I heard every woman who ever thought she wouldn't survive but did. Because that's the truth, we do survive. And we become more than survivors. We become leaders, mothers, mentors, healers. I'm still writing my story every day. And so is Hope. And so are the women of Myra's place. Our stories are not tragedies. They are testimonies. And the echo of my broken home? It no longer haunts me. It sings with hope. Thank you once again for being here. If this is your first time joining this emotional journey, please consider subscribing to the channel. These stories are not fiction. They're inspired by truth, by pain, and by healing. And now let's continue with part 6 of the Echoes of a Broken Home. It had been nearly a decade since Myra's Place first opened its doors, and what started as a safe space for a handful of wounded women had grown into a movement that spanned state lines and inspired shelters in over a dozen cities. Hope was now 10 years old, her voice louder, her laughter fuller, and her questions deeper than ever. She asked about everything: the world, the stars, why people hurt each other, and why her grandmother's pictures still made me cry. She was too perceptive for her age, too empathetic, too aware. She had grown up surrounded by women who bore scars, some visible, some invisible, and perhaps that made her heart more open. One afternoon, while organizing files for an upcoming board meeting, I found a yellowed envelope hidden in the back of my mother's last journal. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to herself. The title read, "If I Ever Find Freedom." My hands trembled as I unfolded the pages, her handwriting slightly faded but unmistakably hers. She had written a list of things she wanted to do if she ever got away: ride a train across the country, dance barefoot in the rain, learn to paint, adopt a dog, watch the sunrise without fear, laugh until her stomach hurt. The simplicity of her dreams shattered me. Not because they were grand, but because they were basic things every woman should have the right to experience. And yet she hadn't. But I had. I had done all those things because of her. That night, I stood in our garden hope chasing. Butterflies behind me, Daniel laughing softly with a book in his hand, and I whispered, "You're free through me, Mama. Every breath I take is yours, too." The seasons changed, as they always do. One autumn, a woman named Natalia came to Mira's place with only the clothes on her back and a daughter the same age as Hope. She had escaped an international trafficking ring, surviving horrors I could barely fathom. She barely spoke English, but pain has no language barrier. Hope immediately befriended her daughter, teaching her words in between games and laughter. And for the first time, I saw the healing power of children. Natalia had deep eyes always. Searching, always alert, but in time she began to open. She painted. She smiled. She began working in our kitchen. She even started sharing her story in group sessions. But what struck me the most was something she said during one of our Sunday circles. I thought my body was ruined. I thought I was less than human. But here I became a person again. Her words echoed in my heart for days. I kept repeating them in my mind. I became a person again. That was it. That's what Myra's Place was truly about, not just shelter, not just safety, but restoration. Restoring identity, humanity, dignity. Around that time, I was approached by a university to receive an honorary doctorate in humanitarian service. They said my story had inspired a curriculum on trauma-informed care and empowerment for social workers. I was honored, but a part of me felt strange receiving such a title. I wasn't a doctor. I was just a girl who survived and decided not to be quiet about it. But then I thought of my mother. How she gave up her dreams. How she taught herself. How to stay strong in silence. I accepted the degree in her name. When I walked across that stage wearing a white dress with a sunflower pinned to my chest, I felt her walking beside me. And in the audience, Hope clapped the loudest. "You're a doctor now?" she asked afterward. I smiled and replied, "A doctor of stories, maybe." She beamed. "Can I be one too?" "You already are," I told her. "Every time you listen, every time you speak with kindness, you are healing the world." But even in joy, grief finds its way back. Clara, our beloved matron, our second mother, our rock fell ill. At first, we thought it was exhaustion, but tests revealed late-stage cancer. She was brave, calm, matter-of-fact. "I've lived more in these last 10 years than I did in my whole life," she said. "I'm not afraid. Just promise me one. Then tell more stories." I visited her every day in hospice, reading letters from the women she had helped. Hundreds had written back, "You held me when I couldn't stand. You made me laugh again. You told me I wasn't crazy." Hope drew her pictures and sang her songs. On her final day, Clara whispered, "Keep telling them, even when it hurts." And then she was gone. Her funeral was held at Mira's Place. Women came from all over the country, survivors, volunteers. Mothers, daughters, we planted a tree in her honor, an olive tree, symbol of peace and resilience. Hope wrote a poem for her. "You gave hugs like blankets and smiles like sun. You weren't just anyone, you were the one." It was the first time I cried in front of everyone, because Clara was family. She'd been the mother I needed after my own was taken from me too soon. After that, I started writing again, but this time not for publishing, not for interviews. I wrote for myself, for my soul. I wrote letters I never send, stories I never share. I called it the Book of Silent Healing. And every time I felt overwhelmed, I would read from it in the quiet hours of the night. Hope continued to grow into the most beautiful soul. At 11, she gave her first public speech at a girls' leadership camp. She told them, "My mama helps broken women fix their wings. And I think we can all learn how to fly, even if someone tried to break us." The audience cried. I cried. But more than anything, I believed her. Because she had become everything. I prayed she would be free, fierce, kind, and whole. That year, on the anniversary of my mother's death, I did something I had never done before. I visited her grave alone. I brought sunflowers. I sat in silence for over an hour. And then I spoke aloud. "You didn't die in vain, Mama. You're alive in everything I do. You were the seed. I was the soil. And now your garden blooms." I looked at the sky, the clouds parting just slightly to let a single beam of sunlight fall on the ground. beside me, I smiled. She was listening. She always had been. And as I walked away, I felt lighter. Not because the grief was gone, but because it had transformed. It had become love. It had been years since I felt broken, years since the fear inside me controlled my every breath. And now, standing in the warmth of a community I helped create, I could finally say with honesty, I was no longer surviving. I was living. Myra's place had become more than a shelter. It was a legacy stitched together by every woman who walked through its doors, leaving behind not only pain but also strength, laughter, sisterhood. The mural of my mother now had a permanent plaque beneath it, in memory of all the women who stayed silent so their daughters could learn to speak. And next to it, a small sunflower garden bloomed every season, bright, brave, alive. Hope had just turned 12, taller than ever, eyes full of wonder and courage. One evening, while I was in the office sorting through grant proposals, she walked in holding an old shoebox she had found under my bed. Inside were faded photos of my childhood, most of them bittersweet, many filled with faces I hadn't seen in decades. "Mama," she asked, "who's this man with you and Grandma?" I paused. It was my father. A rare photo of him smiling, his hand awkwardly resting on my shoulder. My mother standing just a little behind, her smile almost believable if you didn't look too closely. I had never shown her his face before. Not because I wanted to erase him, but because he didn't deserve to take up space in her mind. But I realized in that moment I had healed enough to talk about him without bleeding. I sat her down and told her everything. The truth. He was your grandfather. He hurt us. He hurt me. He hurt your grandma. He was a broken man who never chose to heal, and he made everyone around him carry the weight of that brokenness. Hope listened quietly, eyes wide but not afraid. Then she said something I didn't expect. "I'm glad you stopped it, Mama, so I don't have to carry it too." Her words hit me like a wave, because that was it. That was everything. I had broken the chain. I had taken the burden of generations and refused to pass it on. That night, I wrote a letter to my younger self, the little girl hiding in closets, listening to doors slam, praying for silence. "You were always brave," I wrote, "and you did it. You grew up and you made sure no one else would suffer what you did." That week, Myra's Place launched a new program called Brave Girls Circle, a mentorship initiative pairing young girls from at-risk homes with women survivors who could teach them strength, kindness, and self-worth. Hope volunteered to be one of the first peer mentors. "I want to be the friend I needed," she said. One girl she mentored, Alina, was just 9. Her father had been arrested for abuse. Her mother still recovering. Alina barely spoke when she arrived. But with Hope by her side, she began to sing, literally sing. Every Friday, they performed in the small rec room, 2 voices echoing through the halls, healing not just themselves, but everyone who heard them. Daniel and I watched quietly every time, hands clasped, our hearts bursting. One afternoon, while updating our website's blog, I received an email from a major publishing house. They had read Myra's Garden, the children's book I wrote in memory of my mother, and wanted to publish it internationally. They wanted to translate it into 10 languages. I cried, not because of the opportunity, but because it meant that my mother's voice would now be heard by children across the world. Little girls in Brazil and Pakistan and Norway and Kenya would read about a woman who planted hope and fought silently for her daughter's light. I signed the contract that evening with tears on the paper. But with that joy came another challenge. The publishing house wanted a book tour. They wanted me to travel weeks at a time. I hadn't left Hope for more than 2 nights in 12 years. She was my heartbeat. But when I hesitated, she said, "Go, Mama, Grandma's story needs to be told. I'll take care of the garden." My heart cracked and bloomed all at once. The first city on the tour was New York. The moment I walked on stage to a packed auditorium of students, teachers, and survivors, I held the first printed copy of Myra's Garden in my hands. I read it out loud. And when I reached the last page where the little girl plants sunflowers in memory of her mother, the entire room rose to their feet. Applause, tears, hugs. One little girl came up to me afterward and said, "My mama cries a lot. I think she's like your mama. Can I give her your book?" I knelt down and hugged her, barely able to speak. I visited 9 countries in 6 months. Each place had different languages, different customs, but the pain was the same. The silence was the same. But now, the healing was also the same. I returned home to a fully blooming sunflower garden, a bigger mural, and a new surprise. Hope had organized a community poetry night in my absence, and dozens of children had written about courage, kindness, and safety. My soul was full. The next day, Daniel gave me a tiny envelope. Inside was a picture of a small plot of land just outside our city. "I bought this," he said, "for the next chapter." I was confused. "What chapter?" He smiled. "The Mira Institute. You've built a shelter, now build a school. A space for girls to learn, grow, lead, not just heal, thrive." I stood there, overwhelmed, my hand over my mouth. Could I do it? Could we really turn a movement into a legacy that would outlive all of us? "Let's start," I whispered. And we did. We began work on the Mira Institute with trembling hands but fierce hearts, because what we were building wasn't just another center, or another charity, or another good intention trapped inside walls. We were building the future for girls, who would one day lead without ever knowing what it felt like to hide bruises under sweaters or lie to teachers about falling down the stairs. The land Daniel had bought was beautiful, quiet, and surrounded by trees that danced in the wind. Like they already knew children would be laughing beneath them. We held a community meeting to share our vision, classrooms that taught resilience, dorms that felt like home, gardens where healing bloomed beside education, and spaces for art, movement, voice, and light. Survivors from Myra's place showed up with blueprints and hammers and paintbrushes. Volunteers poured in from nearby cities. Construction workers worked overtime for half their pay. Hope and her friends painted rocks to decorate the pathways. The entire community built it together. Brick by brick, scar by scar, dream by dream. And when we placed the final sunflower tile on the front gate that read the Mira Institute, where brave girls become brave women, I broke down. I didn't sob like I used to. I cried quietly, as if every tear was a memory leaving my body, gently. The opening ceremony was held in late spring. The sun was warm, the trees full of bloom, and the stage was set with nothing fancy, just chairs, smiles, and the sound of birds instead of loud music. I stood in front of a crowd that had become my family over the years, former residents, board members, friends, journalists, strangers turned supporters. And in the front row sat Hope, 12 now, wearing a white dress with a sunflower brooch and her mother's eyes staring back at me. I took a deep breath and began. I once lived in a house where silence was survival, where fear lived in the hallway, where my mother died not with blood, but with invisible wounds. But today, this is not about pain. It's about what comes after, what rises from ashes. This land, this place was born from women who refused to stay broken. And every girl who enters this gate will know one thing above all else: she matters. The applause was overwhelming, but what shook me was what happened afterward. A little girl, no older than 8, walked up to me and handed me a folded paper. "I wrote this," she said shyly. "It's about you." I opened it. In wobbly handwriting, it read, "You made a home where there was none. You gave hugs that fixed things. I want to be just like you. But not just you. I want to be me. Because you taught me that's okay." I hugged her for a long time, because that right there was the real award. The real victory. A few months later, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived from a woman named Yasmin in another country, translated through a local support center. She'd been trafficked for 7 years before escaping. Someone had smuggled a copy of Myra's Garden to her through a volunteer. She read it to the girls in her hidden safe house. "We cried together," she wrote, "because we knew we weren't alone anymore. Because your mother's story was our story." That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking of how far one voice could go if it refused to be quiet. My mother never got to write books or speak at events. But through me, through all of us, she was speaking now, across borders, across languages, across time. I wanted to tell her, "Look what you started, Mama. Look what your courage built." Daniel held me close that night, whispering, "She knows. She always knew." Hope started middle school soon after and insisted on doing a class project on intergenerational healing. Yes, at 12, she was brilliant, passionate, fearless. She stood in front of her class and said, "My grandmother was hurt. My mom was brave, and now I get to grow up free. That's what love does, it fixes what pain tried to break." Her teacher called me in tears. I've never seen anything like it. Hope wasn't just my daughter, she was every woman's second chance. Meanwhile, Myra's Place expanded to include legal aid, transitional housing, and a helpline that answered calls 24 hours a day. We received funding to build similar shelters in 3 new cities. I trained staff, traveled, gave lectures, and mentored young survivors turned leaders. But somewhere in the chaos of doing, I realized I hadn't rested in years. One evening, I took Hope to the lake where my mother used to take me. The same lake I once sat beside when I cried for the first time after escaping. This time I brought no journal, no speech, no schedule. Just us. We sat in silence, watching the sunset. Hope leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "Mama, you happy now?" I smiled. "Yes, baby." More than I ever thought I could be. And it was true. I was happy, not because everything was perfect, but because I had earned this peace. Through every storm, every scar, every story I had fought for this stillness. That night I started a new book, not about trauma, not about survival, but about joy. It was called After the Rain, because healing deserves its own story too. Not just the breaking, but the becoming, the dancing, the freedom, the joy that comes when you realize the pain didn't win. The next morning, we planted another sunflower in the garden. Hope placed a small sign beside it. It said, "For all the girls who felt they'd never smile again." It had been over a decade since I first walked out of the house that stole my childhood. Yet every day I continued building something stronger than fear, something louder than silence. And as Myra's Place expanded, so did the circle of women. Girls and now even boys whose lives were forever altered by what we started with: nothing but grief, courage, and a sunflower seed of hope. The Myra Institute was thriving. Girls who once arrived with trembling hands and guarded eyes now danced freely through the halls, laughing loudly without apology, and filling notebooks with dreams that once seemed too dangerous to speak aloud. But as our world grew brighter, I felt a whisper return, something I had long buried under the joy of parenting and purpose. A part of my story was still untold, not to others but to myself. And it wasn't about my father. It was about forgiveness. I didn't know what forgiveness looked like, only what survival did. But one afternoon, while reorganizing our archives for an upcoming donor event, I stumbled across a file we had kept locked away, case records from our early years, confidential. Intake interviews, and among them, a police report from the night my mother died. I had never read it. I had lived it, felt it, survived it, but I had never seen it in black and white. My hands trembled as I opened the page, expecting cold details. Facts that would cut through the scar tissue I had carefully built around that night. But what I didn't expect was a second page. A handwritten note from the responding officer, dated weeks after the case was closed. It read, "We failed her, I failed her. There were signs and I saw them and I didn't act. I told myself it wasn't my place. I was wrong. I'm sorry." I sat there for hours staring at that page. The man who wrote it had probably moved on, retired, forgotten her name. But those words, "I failed her," hit like thunder across my chest. For the first time, I cried not from rage, not from regret, but from understanding. Everyone had failed her. The neighbors, the family, the system. Even the younger me who had believed she could have done more if only she'd said something sooner. But what if we all just didn't know how? What if no one ever taught us how to hold pain instead of hiding it? That week, I created a workshop called The Other Side, designed for police officers, teachers, pastors, and judges, anyone in power who had ever overlooked a silent scream. The first session had only 9 people. The second, over 60. By the end of the month, over 500 professionals had signed up to learn how to listen differently. It wasn't about blame. It was about change. One of the first officers we trained came up to me after a session and said, "Your story rewired something in me. I've been on the force 20 years and I realized I've never actually asked a victim, 'What do you need?' I only ever asked, 'What happened?'" That distinction stayed with me. Because survivors didn't need to relive their pain, they needed someone to help rewrite what came after. Meanwhile, at home, Hope had grown into a fierce preteen, full of curiosity and a love for storytelling. She'd begun keeping a journal of her own, one she didn't hide from me. In fact, she often read it aloud during our Sunday porch evenings, sipping cocoa and watching the stars peek through the dusk. "Dear future me," she read once, "please remember that you come from strong women. Please don't settle for love that feels like waiting to be heard. And please keep planting sunflowers because Mama says they're made from light. I looked at her in awe. She was becoming her own voice, not an echo of mine. And that was the greatest gift of all. That fall, we were invited to speak at a global women's conference in Geneva. Hope came with me, holding my hand through airport terminals, excitedly reading her small speech on the plane. "I want to tell the world," she whispered, "that someday we had our first hard mother-daughter conversation. She'd asked about love. Not the kind in fairy tales, but real love. How do you know when it's safe?" she asked. I looked at her, remembering all the times I hadn't known. And I said, "It's safe when you don't feel smaller around it. When it doesn't ask you to be quiet. When you don't have to earn it by hurting less." She nodded. "Like Dad." "Yes," I said, "like your dad." Later, Daniel joined us on the porch and Hope asked him, "Why do you love Mama?" He didn't even blink. "Because she reminds me that even broken things can shine. And because she never asks me to fix her, just to walk beside her." I wrote that down. Because it was exactly what I'd always prayed for but never knew how to ask. That winter, Mira's Place celebrated its 15-year anniversary. We held a candlelight vigil for every woman who hadn't survived, every mother who never got the chance to see her daughter grow up free. The garden was full of light, every flame a story, every sunflower a name. Hope stood beside me as we read each one. "We don't forget them," I said. "We carry them forward, and we do. Every day. Every breath. Every time we smile after years of not knowing how. We carry them. We become the stories they weren't allowed to finish." 15 years after my mother's last breath, I finally found the courage to record hers in my own voice, to sit with a microphone late into the night, while everyone else slept, and speak out loud every story I had once only written in journals. Whispered in prayer or buried beneath years of pretending I was fine. I called it The Quiet War, a podcast about what it means to survive violence no one sees, violence of silence, of isolation, of being unseen even in your loudest screams. It began with one episode, one night, just me in a dark room telling the story of how my mother used to hum to herself in the kitchen to drown out the yelling in the living room, how she smiled at neighbors even after her lip bled, and how I learned to walk on tiptoe before I learned to tie my shoes. I spoke slowly, trembling, not for the world to hear me, but to hear myself. And somehow that quiet confession turned into a movement. Within a week, women from across the world sent voicemails, letters, emails. "I hummed too," one wrote. "I learned to read so I could escape into books," said another. "I thought I was the only one who lived afraid of the sound of keys in the door." The podcast went viral not because it was sensational, but because it was true. Because pain, when spoken with honesty, becomes permission. The permission to feel, to heal, to begin again. And as I shared my story, more voices joined in. I invited survivors to speak not about the violence, but about what they built after. One woman shared how she opened a bakery that only employed domestic violence survivors. Another built a mobile clinic for women in rural villages. A teenager told the world how she taught self-defense to girls in her school after her father was arrested for assaulting her mother. Every episode was a battle cry wrapped in softness. Hope, now 13 and wise beyond her years, started editing the podcast for me. She learned audio software faster than I ever could. "Mama," she said once, "do you think Grandma can hear you now?" I looked at her, tears in my eyes. I think she's the one pressing record. We launched a special series titled Letters to Our Younger Selves. Women wrote in, reading letters to the girls they once were, the girls who didn't know how to say no, who thought pain meant love, who stayed quiet because they thought speaking meant destruction. One woman ended her letter with, "You did nothing wrong. You were just a child. You didn't deserve it. And now you get to live." That line stayed with me. Because sometimes healing isn't about rewriting what happened, it's about finally believing it wasn't your fault. Around the same time, Hope received her first real invitation to speak solo at a youth leadership summit. She was nervous. "What if I freeze?" she asked. I took her hands, the same hands that had once held mine during nightmares, and said, "Even if you freeze, your heart won't. Just speak from there." And she did. She stood on a stage in front of hundreds of teens and told them, "I come from a woman who broke the cycle. I'm not a victim. I'm a garden." And every time I smile, I plant something my mother didn't get to grow. There was a standing ovation. Not because she was perfect, but because she was true. Later that night, she curled up next to me and said, "Do you think I'm becoming the kind of woman you wanted me to be?" I kissed her for it and said, "You're becoming more than I ever dreamed. You're becoming you." That winter, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived from my father's cousin, someone I hadn't spoken to since childhood. She said she had found old photos, old letters, and thought I might want them. I hesitated. I didn't want to open wounds I had stitched so carefully. But something told me I needed to see. When the package arrived, I sat alone with it, heart pounding. Inside were photos of my parents when they were young before the violence, before the silence when they were still two kids in love with the idea of forever. There was a letter, too, from my mother to her sister, never sent. In it, she wrote, "I know he's changing. I know the bruises are not just from falling, but I love him. I don't know how not to." I cried not for her weakness, but for her honesty. Because how many women stay not because they're weak, but because they believe love means endurance? I folded the letter carefully, placed it in a frame, and hung it in my office, not as a memory of pain, but as a lesson. That love, real love, does not destroy. It does not silence. It does not kill. It builds. It protects. It stays soft. Around spring, we held a retreat at Myra's Institute called the Rebirth Weekend. Survivors came from across the world, some for the first time stepping on a plane, some leaving their shelters just for those 3 days, some with babies in tow. There were dance circles, silent journaling under trees, fireside storytelling. One woman who had been trafficked for years stood and said, "I'm not a body. I'm not a number. I'm not a secret. I'm someone. And I forgive myself for not knowing that sooner." And in that moment, dozens of women cried with her. Not because they pitied her, but because they understood. Forgiving ourselves is sometimes the hardest thing. That night, under the stars, we released lanterns into the sky. Each lantern held a note, something we were letting go of. Mine said, "The belief that I was ever too broken to be whole." And when I watched it rise into the night sky, I smiled. Because I finally believed it. I was not broken. I was rebuilt. And Hope, she was the proof. Daniel, he was the shelter. Myra's place was the revolution. And me? I was no longer afraid to speak. I was the voice. By the time the sunflowers bloomed that year, the world had already heard our story 1,000 different ways on stages, in journals, across podcast airwaves, and through whispered retellings in the dark corners of women's shelters where hope was often too fragile to speak out loud. And yet, even with all the noise of recognition, I still found myself returning to silence every night because that was where I truly felt. In the quiet hours when everyone else was asleep and the walls hummed with stillness, I sat by my window, watching the moon cast shadows across the mirror garden, and I thought about how many women I had buried in my soul. My mother, Clara, strangers I never met but mourned like sisters. Grief never left. It only learned how to walk beside joy, without collapsing. It was on one such night, curled in a blanket Hope had crocheted for me as a birthday gift, that I received a message that made the past shudder through me all over again. It was from someone I hadn't seen since I was 12. My cousin Emma. The one who used to braid my hair and sneak sweets into my school bag, the one who stopped visiting us when things got bad at home, the one I assumed had chosen safety over sisterhood. Her message was short. "I heard your story. I owe you an apology. Can we talk?" My hands froze over the keyboard. Because some ghosts don't knock, they arrive with familiarity that feels like both love and betrayal. Still, I replied, "Yes." We met at a quiet cafe near the lake, a place far from the noise of the city or the spotlight that sometimes followed my work now. Emma looked older, of course, but her eyes were still kind, those same eyes that once looked at me with guilt. When she watched bruises form on my arms and never said a word. She didn't speak for the first few minutes, just stared at her coffee cup like it contained all the answers to a past she'd tried to bury. Finally, she whispered, "I knew. I knew he was hurting you. I knew your mom was fading. But I didn't know how to help. I didn't know if anyone would believe me. And so I left. I ran from you when you needed me most." I looked at her, the younger version of myself screaming somewhere deep in my chest, and I said softly, "I used to hate you for that." She nodded. tears in her eyes. I hated myself too. But then I did something I never thought I would. I reached for her hand. We were children, Emma. No one ever taught us what to do with broken things. We just hid them. We sat there in silence for a long time, two girls grown into women, trying to heal what distance and trauma had carved between us. After that, we stayed in touch. She began volunteering at a shelter in her city. Sometimes she joined our podcast, reading poetry she wrote about regret, forgiveness, and rediscovery. And with every episode, she stitched herself closer to the healing I had once thought was only mine to earn. Meanwhile, Hope began preparing for her 14th birthday. She wanted no gifts, just letters. Ask people to write me one sentence, she said, about the bravest thing they've ever done. We posted the request online. We expected maybe 50 responses. We received over 20,000 from strangers, survivors, students, grandmothers, prison inmates, soldiers. One wrote, "I left him even though I had nowhere to go." Another said, "I looked in the mirror and said, 'You're still here.'" That's enough. We read every single one aloud on the night of her birthday. Candles lit, friends gathered, a room filled with words that pulsed like heartbeat. Hope smiled through tears. "These are my gifts," she whispered. "Their stories are my candles." And I knew then that she wasn't just my daughter anymore. She belonged to every woman who needed proof that love could be safe, that homes didn't have to hurt, that futures could be rewritten. Around that same time, Daniel and I celebrated 15 years together. We didn't throw a party. We didn't post on social media. Instead, we returned to the lake, the one my mother used to take me to, the one where I first learned that silence could be peaceful, not painful. We sat on a bench, watching the water shimmer under the fading sun. He took my hand and said, "Do you realize you've changed the world, one broken piece at a time?" I looked at him, my heart soft and open. "I didn't change the world. I just stopped hiding from it." He kissed my hand. Same thing. Back at Myra's place, the walls were covered with art made by survivors. One wall held nothing but mirrors with affirmations written across them. "You are not your pain. You are allowed to rest. You are the hero of your story." Another room was filled with recorded lullabies, songs sung by mothers who had once cried themselves to sleep in our halls. It was therapy. It was memory. It was love. One evening, as I walked through those halls alone, I ran into a young girl named Layla. She was barely 9. Had been rescued from a home where silence meant survival. She looked up at me and asked, "Are you the lady who builds places where people don't get hurt anymore?" I smiled. "I try to be." She reached into her pocket and handed me a crumpled drawing. It was a house with a garden, with sunflowers and stick figures, one of them labeled "you." The other me, "I want to live in this house one day," she said, "where people look happy for real." I bent down and hugged her. "You already do, sweetheart. You already do." That night I cried not because I was sad, but because I had lived long enough to see the other side of pain. I had become what I once prayed for. I had built what I once needed. I had watched my daughter grow into a mirror without cracks. And through every story I told, every hand I held, every scar I kissed without judgment, I was no longer a broken girl hiding from the world. I was a woman who turned her wounds into wings. And I was still rising. The summer after Hope turned 14 was the quietest I had known in years, not because life slowed down, but because I finally had the space to breathe without bracing for pain, to wake up without the ghosts of old screens vibrating in my ribs, to drink coffee on the porch not as a survival ritual, but as a small celebration of peace I had earned. That silence, that stillness was sacred. And in that space, something inside me whispered for more, not more success or more recognition, but more depth, more truth, more me. So I began something I had never dared attempt before, a memoir not for publishers, not for interviews, but for Hope. A book she could read as a woman someday and understand the full journey of her mother, not just the highlights, not just the brave parts, but the whole mosaic, the parts that cracked, bled, burned, and somehow still found the will to rebuild. I titled it Roots Beneath Ashes, and I wrote it every morning before sunrise, while the world was quiet and my truth didn't have to perform for anyone. I wrote about the day I first hid in a closet while my father broke a plate across the wall, and my mother whispered my name like a shield. I wrote about the time I ran barefoot through snow after he hit her too hard, and I screamed so loud into the cold it startled even him. I wrote about the time I found my mother sitting silently in the bathtub, fully clothed, staring into nothing, and how I climbed in with her, hugged her soaked body, and promised her someday we would both be safe. These were not stories I told on stages. These were the stories I needed Hope to know, not because I wanted her to pity me, but because I wanted her to understand the bloodline she came from. Not a line of victims, but a lineage of survival. I wanted her to know that her strength came, not just from watching me heal, but from the ancestors of pain I carried inside me. Women whose names were never spoken, but whose pain pulsed in our veins like a hymn. One day, while writing, Hope walked in quietly, sat beside me, and asked, "Mama, do you ever wish it had been easier?" I paused, looking out the window, the garden swaying in the summer wind, and said, yes and no. Easier would have made me softer in the wrong ways. The pain made me sharp. The healing made me soft. She nodded, pulling her knees to her chest. I think I'm both. I smiled. You are. That's your power. That weekend, we hosted a retreat at Mira's, place just for teenage daughters of survivors, girls who, like Hope, carried stories they never lived but somehow felt deep in their skin. We called it Hereditary Light, and it was one of the most emotional weekends we had ever witnessed. Girls shared poems they had written for mothers who couldn't stop crying, letters to absent fathers they barely remembered, art that screamed without words. One girl, just 13, stood and said, "My mom never told me the full story. But I see it in how she flinches at loud voices, how she locks every door twice, how she never takes a deep breath. And I just want her to know. She doesn't have to protect me from her pain. She can show me. I can hold it too." The entire room wept, not because it hurt, but because it healed. That girl's mother later told me, for the first time, I stopped trying to be her shield and just became her truth. And that was what we had been building all along. A world where pain wasn't buried but composted into growth. Later that year, we received news that Mira's Place had been nominated for a Global Humanitarian Award. I almost didn't accept, because awards had never been the goal. But Hope said, if you don't go, another woman might think her work is too quiet to matter. So we went. We flew to Berlin. I stood on stage in front of thousands of leaders, activists, and survivors. I held a piece of my mother's scarf in my hands, still worn, still smelling faintly of jasmine. And I said, my mother died in silence. But every day, through this work, I raise her voice louder than his fists ever were. Mira's Place is not just a shelter, it's an uprising of softness in a world that tried to crush us. And if you're a survivor listening, you don't have to build a center to matter. You just have to stay alive, stay soft, stay here. Afterward, dozens of women came up to me not to congratulate me, but to thank me. One said, "You made me believe I'm more than what happened to me." Another said, "I didn't think I deserved joy, but now I'm going to try." And that more than the award, more than the applause, that was the win. We returned home to a surprise. Hope had organized a Garden of Names installation in the Mira courtyard. A sunflower was planted for every woman who had passed through our center, each with a handwritten tag of a name or simply a word they chose for themselves: brave, reborn, soft storm. I walked through that garden, fingers brushing petals, and felt every life pulse around me. They were not forgotten. They were not statistics. They were stories still growing. That night, Hope sat beside me and said, "Mama, one day when I have a daughter, I'll tell her she came from women who turned silence into music." And I wept not because I was sad, but because I had lived long enough to see the legacy bloom. I kissed her forehead and whispered, "And she believe you, because she see it in your smile." The fall that followed was golden in every way: the leaves, the skies, the glow that seemed to settle over our lives like a warm blanket after a long storm. And yet, even in that golden calm, I found myself facing a part of the journey I had not yet touched: the fear of what comes after healing. It's a strange thing to say, I know. But when you spend your entire life surviving, fighting, building, rescuing others and yourself, what happens when the fires go out? Who are you without pain? Who are you when the ache no longer guides you? I woke up one crisp October morning, stared at the ceiling, and realized I was free, and it terrified me. I wasn't used to peace. I didn't know how to sit in stillness without guilt. So I called Dr. Larkin, the therapist who had helped me during the first few years of Mira's Place, And I said, I think I've healed, but I don't know how to live healed. She laughed gently and replied, then it's time to shift from survival to joy, from reflection to presence. So I tried. I started by doing little things I never had time for when my life was about trauma, dancing in the kitchen without a reason, baking pies from scratch with hope, watching clouds from a hammock Daniel built, reading novels that had nothing to do with pain. I took a pottery class, and for the first time in years, I created something with my hands that wasn't built to save, just to be beautiful. And it was in the middle of that class, as I shaped clay with soft fingers, that I realized healing doesn't end, it evolves. Just like clay, we're constantly being molded, not back into what we were, but into who we were always meant to be. Hope noticed the change in me, too. One night, she said, Mama, you laugh more now, like really laugh, your eyes crinkle. And I smiled. That's what joy feels like, baby. At school, she started her own club called Sunlight Circles. Space where girls could talk about anything. Anxiety, pressure, relationships, grief. No teachers. Just couches, tea, and honesty. Her principal emailed me and said, Hope is leading in ways we haven't seen in students her age. And I thought, of course she is. She was born from fire and grown in light. Meanwhile, Myra's place had expanded to a second location, this one near the border, where access to trauma-informed care was rare. We named it Clara's Home, after one of our earliest residents, a woman who had survived 3 decades of abuse and died during the pandemic, but not before spending her final year with us, painting murals and teaching poetry to the younger girls. Clara had once said, if I can give someone a softer start than I had, I've done my job. That place became her legacy. And mine. One evening, I stood in Clara's home courtyard, surrounded by dozens of young women, and I felt something I hadn't in years, completion. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was true. And then, just as life had settled into a rhythm of wholeness, a call came that shook the very foundation of everything I thought I had let go of. My father, who I hadn't seen or spoken to in over 20 years, was dying, liver failure, in a hospice center 2 states away. And the nurse who called said, he keeps asking for you. He doesn't have much time. My hands went numb. My breath stilled. Daniel found me sitting on the floor, staring at nothing. I thought I buried him, I whispered. And Daniel, being Daniel, just held me. No judgment, no pressure, just presence. For 3 days, I couldn't decide. Should I go? Should I let him die alone? Did he deserve anything from me after what? He stole my childhood, my mother, my voice. But something inside me, some soft, weathered part of my soul said, go, not for him. For you. So I went. I boarded a train, no fanfare. No dramatics. Just me, a journal, and a heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. When I arrived, he was unrecognizable. Older, smaller, weaker, the man who once filled rooms. With rage now barely filled his hospital bed. He looked up at me with eyes clouded by time, and for a moment, he didn't recognize me. Then he whispered, you look just like her. I didn't speak. I couldn't. He reached for my hand, and instinct made me flinch. He noticed. A tear rolled down his cheek. I deserve that, he said. Silence again. Then, in a voice softer than I ever remembered, he said, I was a coward. I destroyed everything good. I never deserved her. Or you? I stared at him. The part of me that wanted to scream battling with the part that had already cried enough. And finally I said, you're right. He nodded, coughing. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to say I see it now, all of it, and I'm sorry. I sat with him for 2 hours, didn't touch him, didn't console him, just listened. And when I left, I didn't feel healed. I didn't feel closure. I just felt done. That night, I wrote in my journal, some goodbyes don't need words. Some endings are just the closing of a door you no longer fear. When I returned home, Hope hugged me tight. Was it awful? She asked. I shook my head. It was necessary. And that was the truth. Not every chapter ends with peace. Some just end, and that's enough. That week, I finished my memoir and handed it to the publisher who had been waiting for it for years. It will release next spring, titled exactly as I first wrote it, Roots Beneath Ashes. And I hope one day someone reads it and realizes that healing isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering differently. Because now when I remember, My mother, I don't just see her pain, I see her courage. Her humming in the kitchen, her soft hands on my face, her laughter when it was safe. And when I remember myself, I don't see the broken girl hiding in closets. I see the woman who built gardens from wreckage. I see the mother who raised a light. I see me, and for the first time in my life, I'm proud. Winter arrived quietly that year, as if the universe knew we had weathered enough storms for a lifetime and deserved a season of calm. Snow fell in soft layers, covering the garden of Myra's place in white lace, and for the first time since it was built, no one cried on Christmas Eve. Instead, laughter spilled from the kitchen, children danced around the fireplace, and women who once whispered their names with shame now sang carols like survivors who had earned every note. I stood in the hallway that night, watching Mem holding a cup of cinnamon tea, and I felt something bloom in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace without fear. I had feared for so many years that joy was temporary, that love came with an expiration date, that any moment of stillness was just a calm before another storm. But that night, something in me finally let go. Not of grief, because grief doesn't leave, it evolves. But I let go of the weight for the next wind. The wait for the next betrayal. The wait for the other shoe to drop. I let it all go. Hope sat beside me, her head on my shoulder, her fingers wrapped around a sketchbook she now carried everywhere. She had started drawing women fierce, joyful, wild, wounded, each one with eyes that mirrored her mother's past and her future. She showed me one that night, a woman sitting under a tree of broken clocks with sunlight pouring from her chest. And the words, "Time didn't break me, it grew me," written across her dress. I couldn't speak. I just kissed her forehead. That was how she spoke now, not just in words, but in truth made visible. Meanwhile, Daniel had begun teaching part-time at a local community center men's groups, fatherhood classes, sessions, on how to love without control. One of his students was a man who had once been arrested for domestic violence. Now he stood at the front of class and said, "I learned from Daniel that strength isn't loud. It's listening, it's leaving space. It's unlearning everything I thought being a man meant." We had come full circle. From victims to teachers, from silence to guidance. And that ripple kept growing. One day, a publisher called to say that the pre-orders for Roots Beneath Ashes had surpassed anything they'd expected. "People are thirsty for truth," she said. "And your voice gives them permission to stop hiding theirs." It wasn't about fame. It never had been. It was about the invisible thread that tied every woman, every daughter, every mother to one another. The thread that said, "You survived. You belong. You matter." That spring, Hope applied for a national art program and was accepted. She'd spend 6 weeks in another city, surrounded by young creators, storytellers, dreamers. The night before she left, we packed her suitcase together, every folded shirt a memory, every sketchbook tucked beside a goodbye I didn't want to say. She looked at me and said, "Mama, do you think you'll cry when I go?" And I smiled, already blinking tears. Of course. But not because I'm scared, because I'm proud. She hugged me tight, then whispered, "I'm not scared either, because I carry you with me." The morning she left, I stood on the porch as the taxi pulled away, her hand waving from the back window. And I realized something else. My job was never to protect her from the world. It was to prepare her to face it with softness. And I had done that. Later that week, I visited Claire's home and found Layla, now 10, helping a new girl unpack her things. She pointed to the sunflower mural on the wall and said, "That's for the women who made it out. You will too." I had never felt more hope than in that moment. It reminded me that this work, this life, was not just about my story. It was about legacy. Not legacy in books or awards, but in the way a little girl comforts another. In the way softness passes from hand to hand like a sacred secret. Back home, Daniel and I started a new Sunday tradition, walking hand in hand through the sunflower fields behind Myra's place. We didn't talk about work, or trauma, or pain. We just watched the wind dance, listened to the earth hum, and remembered that we were still here, still loving, still laughing, still whole. One Sunday, as we walked, I turned to him and asked, "Do you think we've done enough?" He paused, looked around, then looked at me. We gave love where there was none. We planted gardens where there was ash. We taught our daughter how to live with both truth and tenderness. That's not enough. That's everything. That night, I sat on our porch, wrapped in the shawl my mother once wore, now repaired with golden thread hope had stitched in herself. I looked at the stars and whispered, "Mama, your pain didn't end with you. It became purpose. You didn't vanish. You became voice." And I meant it. Because everything we had built, every safe room, every echoing hallway, every song sung by girls once silenced, was her resurrection. I wasn't just her daughter anymore. I was her continuation. And when I finally closed my eyes that night, I dreamed not of the past, but of a meadow full of women, laughing, dancing, healed, sunflowers everywhere, and in the middle of it all, my mother, whole, smiling, humming. Summer returned with the smell of jasmine and second chances, and I woke each morning feeling like I was standing in a house I'd spent my whole life building, every brick laid with pain, every wall painted with resilience, every window wide open to let the light in, and now, finally, I could sit inside that house, barefoot, breathing, unafraid. It was during those long golden days that I found myself thinking more often about legacy, not in the grand sense of public accolades or best-selling books, but in the quiet way our lives echo through the lives of others, in the way a single soft word can change the course of someone else's darkness. Hope wrote me a letter from her art residency, and inside were 3 words that stopped my breath. I feel safe. I sat in the garden reading those words again and again, hands trembling, eyes full, because those were the words I never got to say as a child. I had given her the thing I never had. And that, to me, was the ultimate revolution. She told me. She had drawn a mural with a woman's silhouette carved from mountains, with rivers flowing from her hands and trees growing from her spine. "I made her after you," she said. "You're the strongest thing I've ever known." I stared at that letter, heartbreaking and mending all at once, and whispered, "I'm not strong. I just refuse to disappear." Back at Myra's place, the walls had been repainted, the garden replanted, the rooms filled with fresh-faced women who arrived with suitcases full of silence and left with voices louder than grief. One of them, Sophia, had escaped a trafficker who controlled her life for 5 years. The day she left Myra's place, she looked me in the eyes and said, "You didn't just give me a roof. You gave me my name back." She had it tattooed on her wrist, Sophia, written in the same handwriting she used as a child. She said, "Every time I see it, I remember who I was before I was sold and who I'm becoming now." Her words followed me for weeks. Because that's what trauma does. It steals names, it erases stories, it convinces you that you are whatever happened to you. But healing? Healing renames you. Healing says you are more. And Myra's place had become a home for that kind of resurrection. Daniel, ever the steady ground beneath my feet, had started building a library for the center shelves, filled not just with books on psychology and self-help, but poetry, novels, children's stories, memoirs from survivors who had once written to me after hearing my voice. We called it the quiet room, a space where women could sit, read, cry, dream, or simply exist without being watched or judged. One evening, I walked in and found Layla, now 11, reading The Velveteen Rabbit. She looked up at me and said, "Mama says real things hurt sometimes, but they last longer." I smiled because that's exactly what love is. Not always soft, but always true. That summer, we held a retreat for mothers and daughters. It was the most emotional event we'd ever done. Women who had been too ashamed to tell their daughters about the abuse finally sat beside them, held their hands, and said the 3 hardest words. It happened to me. And their daughters didn't run, they didn't break. They opened their arms and whispered back, "I know. And I still love you." One girl, just 15, stood during our final circle and said, "I used to think my mom was weak, but now I see she's the reason I exist at all. Her survival made me." I looked around that circle, women of every age, every color, every scar, and I realized something. We weren't healing despite our pain. We were healing through it. Our wounds weren't shame. They were maps. Hope returned from the residency, glowing with a kind of calm I had never seen in her before. She walked through the doors of Myra's place and hugged every woman she saw, like she was returning home to her own tribe. "I want to teach an art class here," she told me. Not about drawing, but about turning pain into color. So we cleared out a room and gave her her own space easels, brushes, music, and the walls covered in brown paper where the girls could draw without fear of being perfect. And what bloomed there was magic. Girls who had never spoken in therapy. Drew birds breaking out of cages, suns behind fences, hands reaching for stars. One girl who had been nonverbal since arriving whispered for the first time, "This is what my inside feels like," as she pointed to her mural. Hope cried that day. So did I, because art doesn't just express, it liberates. And my daughter had become a liberator. Late one night, after all the lights were off, she and I sat on the porch watching fireflies, and she asked me a question I'd never expected. "Mama, do you ever miss him?" I knew what she meant: my father. Her grandfather. The ghost who had shaped so much of my childhood. I thought for a long time, then said, "No, I don't miss the man he was. But I miss who he could have been if someone had taught him softness instead of violence." She nodded. "That's why you teach now, to stop the chain." I held her hand and said, "That's why we teach. Because that's what we had become. Not just survivors. Not just storytellers. But chain breakers." That night I dreamed again, not of the past, but of a road winding through fields of sunflowers, and every step I took was on ground paved by women before me. My mother, Clara, Sophia, Layla, Hope, and me. And on that path I heard a voice not loud but clear say, "You've turned your suffering into sanctuary." And I knew that even if my name was never written in history books, even if no statue was ever built in my honor, I had already won. Because I had turned a haunted childhood into a house full of laughter. Because I had raised a daughter who paints the world with healing. Because I had built a space where women could come in broken and leave whole. And because I had learned finally that joy is not the absence of pain, but the decision to love through it, and I would keep choosing that joy every day, for as long as I breathed. It was in early September when I received a letter in handwriting I hadn't seen since I was a teenager, slanted, slightly rushed but unmistakably hers, my Aunt Marianne, my mother's sister. A woman who vanished from our lives when things grew too loud, too violent, too complicated. I held the envelope in shaking hands for nearly an hour before opening it, and when I finally did, the smell of lavender, her perfume, rose like a ghost from paper. Her words were simple, raw, and aching. "I heard what you've built. I see what you've become. And I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me. I didn't expect it." After decades of silence, I had buried her in my memory next to all the others who ran when the screaming started. But here she was, offering no excuses, just a trembling invitation. "If you'll have me, I'd like to meet." And just like that, another crack in my past opened, but instead of swallowing me, it gave me space to breathe. I said yes. We met in a small cafe with hanging plants and soft music, and when she walked in, I stood frozen because her face was so much like my mother's that it stole the breath from my lungs. She wore her grief in her eyes, years of regret, lines drawn by guilt, and as she hugged me, I could feel her pulse trembling. "You look like her," she whispered. I nodded, tears welling. "So do you." We sat for hours. She told me stories about my mother I had never heard, how they used to sing together on the rooftop, how she would sneak books under her pillow, how she once dreamed of being a writer. "But then he came," Miriam said quietly, "and everything stopped." I asked her why she left. She looked away and said, "Because I thought if I stayed, I'd die too." And I didn't hate her for it. I understood. She'd chosen survival. But now she wanted something more: connection. I brought her to Myra's place 2 weeks later. She wept when she saw the mural of my mother, a sunflower crown around her head, painted by Hope. "You made her eternal," she whispered. I nodded. I had to. The world forgot her. I didn't. Miriam stayed with us for a week, and every night she told Hope stories of the girl her mother once was: soft, curious, brave. Hope drew every one of those stories into a sketchbook titled Before the Silence. And in those pages, I saw my mother come back to life, not as a victim, but as a girl with dreams. That fall, something shifted in me again. It wasn't a collapse, it was an expansion. I started letting people back in. People I had once cut out to protect myself. Cousins, old friends, even neighbors who once watched but said nothing. I didn't do it for them. I did it for me. Because healing had made my heart wide enough to hold both memory and mercy. One night, while walking through the quiet room, I found a new resident sitting with her baby. Her name was Raina, 19, escaped a man twice her age who had promised love and delivered only bruises. She looked up at me, eyes hollow, and asked, Do you think he'll find me? I knelt beside her and said, he might look, but he'll never reach you again. Not here, not ever. She crowded into my shoulder like a child, and I held her the way I once wished someone had held me, like she was worth saving. That's what Myra's Place had become, not just a shelter, but a homecoming for every woman who had ever been lost. Inside herself, meanwhile, Hope's art class grew. Girls from outside the shelter started coming. Teachers, volunteers, local therapists even began using the room for trauma, healing through drawing. She called it the Gallery of Becoming, and in it were canvases filled with wings, oceans, broken clocks, keys, doors. Symbols of escape, symbols of survival. One piece made me stop breathing. It was a girl drawn entirely in shattered mirror pieces, each shard holding a different facial expression: anger, sadness, fear, joy, peace. The title was Me in Full. Hope said, we're not meant to be one thing. Mama, we're meant to be everything we've ever survived. And in that moment, I saw not just my daughter, but the woman she was becoming, a healer, a mirror. Flame, around Thanksgiving, Daniel and I hosted a dinner not just for family, but for chosen family. The women of Myra's Place, the daughters, the staff, the survivors who now led others. We pushed all the tables together into one long line, like a feast of love carved from pain, and before we ate, I asked everyone to say what they were thankful for. One woman stood and said, I'm thankful I'm alive. Another said, I'm thankful for the first night I slept without fear. A third soft-spoken, gentle said, I'm thankful my daughter now knows what love should look like. And then it was Hope's turn. She stood, voice trembling, and said, I'm thankful. My mom broke the cycle. Because now I know that hurt doesn't have to be passed down. It can stop. It can end. I wept openly. No shame, just truth. Because that's all I had ever wanted, not perfection. Not applause, just an end. To violence, to silence. To generational ache. And I'd made that happen not by erasing the past, but by walking through it with my head held high. Later that night, as Daniel and I lay in bed, he turned to me and whispered, I don't tell you this enough, but you saved me too. I looked at him surprised. What do you mean? He said, before you, I didn't know how to love without control. I didn't know softness could be strong. You taught me that. Just by being you. I kissed him, overwhelmed, and whispered, then we saved each other. And maybe that's what love really is, not rescue, not romance, but reflection. Reminder of who we are at our most raw, our most human. That winter, the first snow fell during one of Hope's classes. The girls ran outside, barefoot, laughing, spinning in circles. I watched them through the window and thought of my own childhood, of cold nights spent hiding, of quiet prayers whispered into the dark. And I realized those prayers had been answered, not in the way I imagined, but in the life I had built. In the girl outside, spinning with joy. In the women who now sang where they once screamed. In the home that held every broken thing like it was precious. And as snowflakes kissed the earth, I whispered one final promise to the woman I used to be, the girl in the closet, the daughter of silence, the survivor of storms. You made it. And now you are the shelter you once begged for. And that, more than anything else, was my healing. The new year began not with fireworks, but with a deep quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but sacred. Myra's Place was calm, the snow rested on its roof like a soft hand, and inside, the rooms glowed with golden lamps and warm hearts. I walked those halls with the slow peace of a woman who had finally learned how to breathe, not just because the danger was gone, but because the fear had loosened its grip on my lungs. There's something strange about healing. You expect it. To arrive like thunder, like some grand moment where everything suddenly makes sense, but the truth is, it creeps in gently like light under a closed door. And one morning in January, I noticed that I hadn't woken up in a panic for over 3 months. That I no longer jumped at raised voices. That I didn't brace myself every time the phone rang. I stood in the mirror, stared at my reflection, and whispered, you're safe now. And for the first time, I believed it. Hope started painting a new mural that month, her biggest yet. On the entire east wall of Myra's Place, she didn't tell anyone what it would be. She just worked quietly every afternoon, brushes in hand, headphones in, humming as her fingers danced in color. One night I stayed late after a meeting and walked past the room. She didn't see me, but I saw it. A massive tree, its roots tangled. Around shattered clocks, its trunk carved with symbols of pain, bruises, fists, tears, but from those marks bloomed flowers, stars, fireflies. And in the middle of the tree, a little girl curled up, wrapped in her own arms, sleeping peacefully. I covered my mouth and wept because I knew exactly who that little girl was, me, and she was finally at rest. "Do you like it?" Hope asked behind me. I turned. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. She hugged me, paint on her cheek, her hands shaking. I wasn't sure I could finish it. It was too close, too much. But then I remembered, you finished your story, and I came from that. Her voice cracked, and so did mine. Because her art wasn't just decoration, it was declaration. A visual promise that even what's broken can become breathtaking. Around that time, I got a letter from a woman named Lisette, from another country entirely, who had found my story through the book and wrote, "I read your story under a blanket in hiding. I've never told anyone what I've survived. But tonight, I told my sister, because of you." And suddenly, all the late nights writing, all the relived trauma, all the tears spilled across pages, it all felt worth it. Because sometimes healing one voice unlocks 1,000 more. Daniel suggested something bold that week. What if we opened Myra's Place in other cities? I looked at him, surprised. "You think we're ready?" He nodded. "We don't have to replicate it perfectly, just the spirit, the warmth, the welcome." So we made calls, we visited towns. We met survivors who wanted to build something in their own communities. And slowly, quietly, Myra's Place became a movement. Not a brand, not a business, but a blueprint for how to turn pain into purpose, isolation into invitation. That spring, we broke ground on our second official home, this time in a city where shelters were rare and domestic abuse was still considered a family matter, not a crime. But when we opened the doors, the line of women waiting for help stretched around the block. I stood at the entrance, hands trembling, and whispered to each woman, "You're home now." And I meant it. Every single time. Meanwhile, Hope was invited to speak at a national youth conference. She was just 16, but her voice had already reached thousands through her artwork. She stood on a stage in front of people twice her age and said, "My mother didn't give me a perfect life. She gave me a real one. She didn't shield me from her pain, she showed me how to rise through it. And that taught me more about strength than any textbook ever could." She received a standing ovation. I sat in the front row, eyes soaked, clapping like I was the only person in the room. Because I wasn't just watching my daughter succeed, I was watching my legacy grow legs and wings. That night, she and I sat on the hotel balcony, wrapped in blankets, the city glowing below. She said, "Do you think you'll ever stop needing to help people?" I thought for a moment. No, because helping them helps me too. Every woman who walks through Myra's Place fills something in me that once felt hollow. It's not a burden. It's a blessing. She nodded. "Then I want to keep doing this with you. For real, when I'm older. Maybe I'll run my own center one day." I smiled, pulling her close. "You already do. Every brushstroke, every word, every hug you give. You're already building something bigger than both of us." In May, I received an award from a national organization for my advocacy work. They flew me to New York, put me in a dress I never thought I'd wear. I stood on stage, lights hot on my face, and said, "I'm not a hero. I'm just a girl who survived a house full of screams. I'm a mother who wanted better for her daughter. And I'm a woman who believes we don't need to be loud to be powerful, we just need to keep showing up." Afterward, a woman approached me in tears and said, "I never told anyone I was abused until tonight. But your story gave me permission. Thank you." I held her hands, looked into her eyes, and said, "Now your story will give someone else permission. That's how it works. That's how we heal." And walking back to the hotel that night under a sky full of stars, I whispered to myself, "You did it. You turned pain into purpose, and now it will echo forever." When I returned home, the mural at Myra's Place was finally finished. Hope had added one final detail, a mirror set into the trunk of the painted tree so that anyone who stood before it would see their reflection inside the story. Below it were painted words, "This is how healing looks on you." I stood before it for a long time, staring, smiling, and in that moment, I saw everything, not just the woman I was, but the girl I used to be, the mother I became, the healer I grew into. And I whispered to her, we made it. And we're never going back. Summer came again like a promise, kept soft winds brushing through the sunflowers at Myra's place, laughter rising from the kitchen, and every room inside that house glowing with the unspoken truth. We were not just surviving anymore, we were living. I found myself waking up before the sunrise just to sit outside, coffee in hand, barefoot in the grass, watching the sky change like a miracle unraveling in slow motion. There was a time when mornings terrified me, when waking meant remembering. Bracing, surviving all over again, but now they felt like gentle invitations to begin again. And that in itself was a victory I hadn't even known how to hope for. On one such morning, hope came out quietly and sat beside me, wrapped in the blanket I once stitched together from scraps of our old life, the coat I wore during our worst days, a piece of her baby blanket, fabric from the skirt my mother wore on her last birthday. She curled up beside me and said, I had a dream last night. I was standing in front of a room full of girls, teaching them how to draw their feelings. One girl said she felt like a crumpled paper. So I told her to draw herself like a phoenix, something that starts in ashes. I looked at her and whispered, you've already become that for them. And it was true. The girls at Mira's place no longer waited for therapists to fix them. They ran to Hope's art room like it was a sanctuary. She had become a translator of pain, not by using fancy words or degrees, but by being who she was, open, kind, scarred, shining. That week, a woman named Isha arrived, 37, 2 sons, eyes that held centuries of silence. She didn't speak for 3 days. Just sat in the sunroom, holding her knees, breathing so quietly you'd think she was trying to disappear. Then, one afternoon, I found her sitting in front of the mural, touching the mirrored tree trunk with her fingertips. Who painted this? She asked. My daughter, I said. She survived too. Isha nodded slowly. I don't know what I'm surviving yet. I just know I couldn't stay another day in that house. I didn't push, I just sat with her. And the next day she came to Hope's class. She drew. A door locked from the inside. When asked what it meant, she said, that was neat, but I'm turning the key now. And I watched in awe as another woman reclaimed her name, her space, her breath. We started a new initiative that month called The First Light Project, a program that provided care packages and letters for girls still living in unsafe homes. Through secret networks, we reached them, teenagers hiding bruises under long sleeves, children pretending their fathers were kind, young women staring at escape like it was a locked gate. Each package included a letter from one of us, a woman, who had walked through the fire and lived. My letter read, you may feel alone, but we are already waiting for you. There is a room here with your name on it. There is love here and softness and breath. You don't have to stay there forever, you get to choose more. And girls wrote back, some in shaky handwriting, some through whispers passed in school halls. One girl, 14, wrote, I didn't know I was allowed to want peace. I thought this was just life. Thank you for showing me it's not. And that became my fuel, the thing that kept me writing, speaking, showing up, not for fame, not for credit, but for the girl hiding under her bed, waiting for the screams to stop. Meanwhile, Daniel continued building. Not just structures, but trust. He led workshops for fathers who wanted to break the cycle. Men who had never cried in front of their sons now wept in circles, holding hands with strangers, saying the words their fathers never said to them, I'm sorry. I want to be better. One man approached me after a session and said, your husband taught me that I'm not a monster. I'm a man who was never taught how to love, but I'm learning now. 4. My daughter. I looked at him and thought, this is what healing looks like, not just for women, but for families. That summer, Hope and I were invited to speak at an international trauma conference. It felt surreal. 2 girls who once whispered their pain, now standing on a stage, microphones in hand, hearts bared. I began the speech by saying, we don't come from safety, we come from ashes. But somehow we've grown gardens there. Hope followed with her story, painting it not in horror but in hope, and when she said, my mother didn't save me from the world. She taught me how to save myself. The room went silent, then erupted in tears and applause. On the flight home, I held her hand and said, I used to be scared the world would break you. She looked at me and smiled. It did, but only enough to show me what I was made of. When we landed, Isha greeted us at the gate with her 2 boys, now living full-time at Myra's place. "I'm starting my GED," she said, "and I applied for housing. I didn't think I could do it, but watching you and Hope made me believe I could, and again I saw how the light spreads. One story becomes 2, becomes 10, becomes an army of women carrying each other across the finish line." That fall, Hope painted her last piece on the Myra's Place mural, a doorway, wide open with stars spilling out from it. Underneath, she wrote, "Exit wounds. The way out is through." And every girl who walked past it touched the stars like they were real, like they were hers, like she had earned them. And she had. We all had. One evening as I watched the sun dip, behind the garden I thought of my mother, of the little girl I was, of the woman I had become. And I whispered, "I carried us all here, and now we are free. Not perfect, not without pain, but free." And for the first time in my life, I knew that was enough. Autumn arrived gently, and for once in my life, the falling leaves didn't remind me of endings, they felt like beginnings. Like every golden flutter to the ground was an invitation to shed the parts of me that no longer served the woman I'd become. Myra's Place was alive with laughter, warm light, and stories that started with trembling voices and ended with full-hearted, wide-eyed courage. The house that once sheltered only brokenness had now become a haven for rebirth. I stood in the garden one evening, watching the wind push through tall sunflowers, remembering the first time I stepped onto this land with nothing but trauma in my veins and a daughter too small to carry her own pain. And now she carried others. That morning, Hope had begun working with a young girl named Nia, just 12. Quiet as a moth with eyes too big and too haunted for her age, Nia never spoke in therapy. But she followed Hope into the art room like a shadow. The first day, she drew only in black. The second, she added a sliver of gold. By the third day, she handed Hope a piece of paper with a shaky figure standing on a cliff and whispered, "That's me. But I think I can fly." Hope cried in the hallway that night. She said it like a secret, like it was the first safe dream she ever spoke. And I knew exactly what that felt like, speaking a dream for the first time when your whole life you were only taught to survive. Later that week, I received an email from a university professor who had assigned Roots Beneath Ashes in our trauma literature course. She said, "My students have never responded to a book like this before. They said it felt like someone finally saw them, and that hit me deep, because that was all I ever wanted to see and be seen without judgment. Without shame, without the weight of erasure." And now my voice had become a mirror for others, and that mirror wasn't showing wounds, it was showing worth. That fall, we held our first public exhibition called Portraits of Becoming. Dozens of canvases by the women and girls of Myra's Place were framed and hung in a small gallery downtown. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't polished, but it was honest. Visitors walked through rows of emotion, rage, joy, grief, rebirth, all painted with trembling hands and wild hearts. One painting stopped everyone in their tracks, a faceless woman stitched together with golden thread, her chest wide open, and blooming with sunflowers. The title read, "You Thought I'd Stay Broken." That painting was done by Sophia, the same woman who once arrived at Myra's Place too afraid to say her own name. Now she stood in that gallery, holding her chin high, a survivor no longer shrinking. And as people applauded her art, I whispered to her, "You didn't just heal, you created proof of healing." That night, after the exhibition, we had a quiet dinner with all the artists. Hope stood and raised her glass sparkling juice, of course, and said, "Tonight is not just a celebration of what we've made. It's a celebration of what we refuse to lose." Everyone clapped and cried. And I realized something. Healing is not just about moving forward, it's about reclaiming everything that was once stolen. Our creativity, our voice, our joy. Meanwhile, Daniel had begun training new counselors at the second Myra's Place location. He told me, "Every man I train is another link broken in the chain of silence. Every time I teach one of them to listen instead of shout, to hold instead of control, I feel like I'm repairing the world." And he was. He was proof that healing doesn't belong to women alone. That men too can unlearn harm and become builders of safety. One weekend, we invited all former residents of Myra's Place for a reunion. We didn't know how many would come, but they arrived by the dozens, mothers with their children, Young women now in college, grandmothers who had left decades-long marriages built on fear. They brought stories, laughter, cake, and peace. So much peace. There was music in the garden that night, dancing under fairy lights. Girls writing their names on a tree that Daniel carved into the porch beam, the survivor's tree. And as I watched them, barefoot in the grass, spinning like the world had never touched them wrong, I cried not from sadness, but from the overwhelming truth that something I once built out of desperation had become a beacon, a lighthouse, a miracle. I walked inside and found Leyland, now 12, looking through old photos from her first week here. She held one up and said, "I used to look like I didn't believe I existed." I kissed her forehead. "You existed. You were just waiting to arrive." She smiled. And here now, yes, she was. They all were. And in that moment, I realized that Mara's place wasn't just a home. It was a womb. A place where new versions of ourselves could be born again and again, no matter how many times the world tried to end us. That night, as the last of the guests left and the garden grew quiet, I sat on the porch with Daniel and Hope. The air was crisp, the stars above us sharp and brilliant. Daniel held my hand. Hope leaned against my shoulder. No one said anything for a long time. Then Hope whispered, "Do you think Nana sees us?" I looked up. My voice caught. "I think she is us." Because every woman we helped, every girl we held, every silence we shattered was her. My mother, me, Hope, all versions of the same song, a melody that had once been broken but now rose like a hymn through the night. And in that stillness, I felt her presence, not like a ghost, but like breath, and I whispered into the sky, "Thank you." For the fire, for the pain, for the strength I didn't know I had. I carried your story, and now they carry mine. And I knew deep in my bones that this was my inheritance. Not pain, but purpose, not trauma, but truth. And we would never go silent again. It was spring again, the third one since Myra's place opened its doors, and as I stood barefoot in the garden, watching the daffodils push their way through the soil like tiny fists of faith, I realized something I'd never let myself say out loud. I was no longer afraid of the past. It no longer owned me. It lived behind me, yes, but I was not dragging it anymore. I had honored it, grieved it, and now finally I had released it. The house behind me was filled with new laughter, new voices, new stories unfolding. Survivors who had once whispered, "I don't know who I am anymore," were now leading workshops, hosting support groups, and laughing over coffee in the kitchen like it was the most natural thing in the world. Hope had officially launched her nonprofit arm, Canvas of Courage, which offered free art, therapy programs for children of abuse survivors. She painted a mural on the new building's wall, a giant set of wings with room in the middle, for anyone to stand between them. "Everyone gets to be an angel here," she said, and people lined up for photos every day, smiling with the kind of joy that says, "I earned this." Myra's place had grown into 4 locations now, each one full, each one alive. And yet, despite all the awards, the recognition, the growth, my favorite moments remained the quiet ones, the ones where a girl stepped out of her room barefoot in the morning, rubbed her eyes, and for the first time said, "I slept all night." Or when a woman finally opened her journal and wrote, "This is who I am now," and signed it with her full name. Or when someone danced in the kitchen without music, just because her soul had remembered what rhythm felt like. One evening, I received a letter from Layla, now living with her aunt in another city, attending a school that specialized in creative expression. She wrote, "I never told you this before, but you saved me. I thought being small and invisible was the only way to survive. But then I saw you being big and brave and loud, and I wanted to be like that too. I'm starting to take up space now. I think I finally believe I deserve to." I held that letter to my chest and cried, because it wasn't just her she was. Talking about it was me too. The woman who had once whispered apologies for simply existing had now built something that made others feel seen. And that, to me, was the truest kind of justice, not revenge, not punishment, but restoration. Not making the world pay, but making it better. That same week, Daniel and I celebrated 15 years of knowing each other. Not every day had been perfect. We had learned, unlearned, failed, forgiven. But every day had been true. He took my hand and said, "You gave me more than a life. You gave me purpose." I smiled. "You gave me safety." And together, we had built something that outlived the pain that brought us together. Hope turned 17 that summer. For her birthday, she asked if we could plant a memory tree in the back garden, one where every visitor could hang a ribbon, with a word they were reclaiming. We gathered that night with old residents, staff, friends, family, and each one tied a ribbon. Voice. Home, trust, light, future. I tied mine last. It read forgiveness. And I tied it not just for those who hurt me, but for the girl I was, who didn't know what else to do but survive. I forgave her, too. The ribbon swayed in the wind, and I swear I could hear my mother's voice in it. You did it, baby girl. You broke the chain, and I wept not from sorrow, but from relief. I had done what generations before me could not. I had stopped the echo. I had answered it. One morning, a journalist asked me, how do you define healing? And I said, healing is when you can sit in the silence and no longer hear only your pain. When the quiet becomes peaceful instead of terrifying. When your body no longer flinches at kindness, when you can tell your story without shaking, when your past becomes a garden instead of a grave. And she stared at me, tears in her eyes, and whispered, I think I'm still in the grave part. I smiled gently. Then just know this, you're not buried, you're planted. And the bloom is coming. In the final days of that spring. I stood again at the mural inside nearest place, the one with the tree, the broken clocks, the mirrored trunk, and I placed my hand on the glass. For a second, I saw her again, the girl I once was. Bruised, curled in, silent. I looked at her and whispered, we did it. We survived, and we helped others do the same. She didn't smile. She just nodded like she already knew. And just like that, I felt her fade not as someone lost, but as someone who had finally rested. I was not her anymore. I didn't need to be. I walked outside, the sun warming my skin, and as I looked at the rows of flowers, the open doors, the little girls laughing in the distance, I realized something deeper than I ever had before. This is not a story about abuse. This is not even a story about pain. This is a story about what rises after everything falls apart, a story about rebirth, about becoming. And I knew with everything in me that it was time to write a new one, not as the woman who survived, but as the woman who thrived. The woman who led. The woman who no longer whispered in the dark, but stood tall in the light and said, this is who I am. And I am finally free.